At 18, my father threw my backpack onto the lawn and told me I was no longer welcome in his house. Those were the last words Thomas Hayes said to me before slamming the front door in my face on a cold October night in Ohio. I still remember the sound of the lock turning. Calm. Final. Like he'd already decided I no longer existed. I stood there for almost a minute staring at the porch light, half expecting my mother to come outside and tell me this had gone too far. Instead, the curtains in the living room shifted slightly and then closed again. That hurt more than anything my father said. I'm glad you're here with me today. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who survive the hardest nights end up building lives nobody expected. The argument had started over college applications. Brandon, my younger brother, had just gotten accepted into a private university in Chicago, and my parents spent the entire dinner talking about tuition plans, dorm shopping, and how proud they were of him. I sat quietly eating cold mashed potatoes while my father acted like I wasn't even at the table. When I finally mentioned the scholarship letter I'd received from a state school, he barely looked up from his coffee. "You should stop chasing dreams you can't afford," he said flatly. I told him I didn't need their money, that I could work my way through school if I had to. That only made him angrier. My father hated anything that sounded like defiance, even when it was just determination wearing tired clothes. Brandon smirked into his phone while my mother kept asking everyone if they wanted more gravy, pretending she couldn't feel the tension suffocating the room. Then my father leaned back in his chair and said the sentence that changed my life. "If you think you're smarter than this family, then maybe you should figure life out on your own." Nobody spoke after that. The football game playing on the television in the next room suddenly sounded louder than before. I remember hearing rain tapping softly against the kitchen window while my mother stared down at her plate. I waited for someone to stop him. Nobody did. 10 minutes later, my backpack landed outside beside the porch steps. Most of my clothes were still inside the house. My father didn't care. "You'll come crawling back in a week," he said through the screen door. The world doesn't reward attitude. I picked up my backpack without saying anything. That seemed to bother him more than if I'd yelled. Maybe he wanted me angry. Maybe he wanted proof that throwing me away had been justified somehow. But I was too tired to fight anymore. The Greyhound station downtown smelled like coffee, wet jackets, and old newspapers. I bought the cheapest ticket I could afford with the $43 left in my wallet and sat near the back beside a flickering vending machine. Around midnight, an older man in a trucker cap asked if I was waiting for someone. "No," I answered. "I'm just leaving." He nodded like he understood more than I'd said. Outside, buses hissed under the rain while strangers dragged suitcases through puddles beneath the station lights. Families hugged goodbye. Couples argued quietly near the curb. And there I was at 18 years old with one backpack, a nearly dead phone, and nowhere left to go. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed aboard without looking back. Somewhere behind me, my hometown disappeared into the darkness, and for the first time in my life, I realized that some people stop being your family long before they stop sharing your last name. The first winter after I left home felt endless. Cleveland looked different when you had nowhere warm waiting for you at night. The city buses rattled through streets covered in dirty snow, while people hurried past coffee shops with paper cups clutched in gloved hands. I spent the first 3 weeks sleeping in a cheap motel near Interstate 90 until my money finally ran out. After that, I rotated between overnight bus stations, laundromats, and the couch of a coworker named Louise who let me stay for a few nights without asking too many questions. During the day, I worked at a grocery store unloading trucks behind the building. My shift started at 4:30 every morning. By the time the sun came up, my back already hurt and my hands smelled like cardboard and freezer air. At night, I took classes at Cuyahoga Community College because I still refused to let my father be right about me. Most days I survived on instant noodles, gas station coffee, and whatever expired sandwiches the grocery store manager tossed aside before closing. I lost almost 20 pounds by Christmas. My winter coat came from a thrift store and smelled faintly like cigarette smoke no matter how many times I washed it. But the strangest part was not the hunger or exhaustion. It was the silence. Weeks passed without a single call from my parents. No messages. No questions about whether I was alive. At first, I kept checking my phone between classes, convinced my mother would eventually reach out when my father was not around. She never did. One night during my lunch break, I made the mistake of opening social media. Brandon had posted photos from his university dorm in Chicago. In one picture, he stood smiling beside my parents at a steakhouse downtown. My father had his arm around him proudly, while my mother commented underneath, "So proud of our college boy." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Brandon and I were only 2 years apart, but somehow we had grown up in completely different families. He got tuition checks, football tickets, and family vacations. I got $43 and a bus ticket out of town. After that night, something inside me changed quietly. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped imagining dramatic reunions where my parents realized they made a terrible mistake. Real life was not built like movies. Some people wake up every morning and continue choosing themselves without guilt. Around February, I picked up a second job doing overnight technical support for a small shipping company outside the city. Most of the work involved resetting passwords and fixing frozen computer terminals in the warehouse. The office stayed quiet after midnight except for the hum of vending machines and the sound of trucks backing into loading docks. Sometimes I sat alone staring at rows of glowing monitors while snow drifted past the windows outside. Those hours became strangely comforting. Nobody yelled at me there. Nobody compared me to Brandon. The computers either worked or they did not, and problems had solutions if you stayed calm long enough to find them. One night, around 3 in the morning, I caught my reflection in the dark office window. I barely recognized myself anymore. My face looked sharper, older somehow, tired in a way sleep could not fix. But there was something else too. I no longer looked like a kid waiting for permission to exist. The world had stripped away that version of me somewhere between the bus station and those freezing warehouse shifts. And little by little, without anyone noticing, I was becoming someone my father would not know how to control anymore. By the time I turned 24, I had learned that exhaustion could become so familiar it almost felt comforting. My days blurred together in a cycle of warehouse shifts, community college classes, and overnight technical support calls that never seemed to end. Most people my age spent weekends at bars or football games. I spent mine repairing broken inventory systems while eating microwave burritos under fluorescent lights. But somewhere inside all that routine, I had quietly become reliable. The shipping company trusted me with more responsibilities every month because I was always the one who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. Around 2:15 one morning in late March, the entire warehouse network crashed during a snowstorm. Hundreds of outgoing deliveries froze in the system at once. Drivers started yelling into radios while managers paced the office making frantic phone calls. The company processed medical supply shipments across 3 states, and every delayed truck meant angry clients by sunrise. My supervisor, Greg, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "The server backup is corrupted," he muttered while rubbing both hands over his face. "We are completely dead." Most people in the office gave up within the first hour. They sat around drinking burnt coffee and waiting for corporate support teams from New York to call back. But I stayed at my desk pulling apart old system logs one by one, searching for something everyone else had missed. Around 4:30 in the morning, I finally noticed the issue. A tiny software update had conflicted with an outdated security patch nobody bothered removing months earlier. The entire network had been choking itself slowly for weeks until it finally collapsed. I bypassed the corrupted files manually and rebuilt the warehouse routing system terminal by terminal. It took almost 3 hours. My fingers cramped from typing and my eyes burned from staring at code, but little by little the monitors around the office flickered back to life. Shipping labels started printing again. Conveyor belts restarted. Radios crackled with relieved voices from loading docks downstairs. By sunrise, trucks were moving again as if nothing had happened. I was standing near the coffee machine trying to keep myself awake when a woman in a charcoal gray coat walked into the office carrying a leather portfolio. She looked to be in her late 50s with silver streaks in her dark hair and the kind of calm posture powerful people tend to have without trying. Everyone in the building suddenly straightened up when they saw her. Greg nearly spilled his coffee, rushing over to shake her hand. "Miss Cole, we thought corporate was sending someone later this morning." She glanced around the office briefly before her eyes landed on me. "Who restored the network?" she asked. Greg pointed toward me immediately. "Caleb did. Honestly, none of us thought it could be fixed before noon." She walked over slowly while I wiped grease and dust off my hands onto my jacket without thinking. "You stayed overnight for this?" she asked. I nodded. Somebody had to. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, like she appreciated the answer. Most people stop trying once things become inconvenient, she said quietly. That usually tells me everything I need to know about them. Her name was Margaret Cole, Senior Operations Director for Langford Logistics, the parent company that owned half the shipping contracts moving through the Midwest. I had seen her name before in company emails, always attached to major acquisitions and restructuring announcements. She studied the system reports on my screen for a long moment before looking back at me. "Where did you learn to troubleshoot like this?" she asked. I shrugged slightly. "Mostly on my own." Margaret nodded once. "That makes sense." Then she said something nobody had ever told me before. People who teach themselves usually survive things other people never see. The office around us stayed loud and chaotic, but for some reason her words settled into me differently than praise ever had before. Not because she admired my work, because she saw the exhaustion behind it. And for the first time since leaving home, I had the strange feeling that somebody was looking at me as if I might become more than the worst thing that ever happened to me. Margaret Cole started changing my life in ways that barely felt noticeable at first. She never gave long speeches or dramatic encouragement like people do in movies. Instead, she watched quietly. A week after the warehouse crash, she sent me an email asking if I could stay after my shift for a meeting downtown. I almost ignored it because I thought somebody at corporate wanted to complain about overtime paperwork. Instead, I found myself sitting inside a glass conference room on the 32nd floor of Langford Logistics headquarters overlooking the Cleveland skyline, while Margaret reviewed my personnel file in complete silence. The office smelled faintly like coffee and polished wood. Outside the windows, Lake Erie looked gray beneath heavy clouds stretching across the horizon. I remember feeling painfully aware of my cheap shoes against the spotless carpet. "You have been taking college classes at night for 6 years, Margaret finally said without looking up. "Most people quit after one." I shrugged slightly. "Most people are smarter than me." That made her look up immediately. "No," she said calmly. "Most people just have safety nets." Nobody had ever explained my life that way before. Not as failure, not as weakness, just absence. Absence of help, absence of protection, absence of someone waiting to catch you when things went wrong. Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. "I read the incident reports from the warehouse outage," she said. "You solved in 3 hours what our outsourced consultants could not solve remotely all night." I stayed quiet because I still did not know what she wanted from me. Finally, she slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer for a junior systems analyst position at Langford headquarters. Full salary, health insurance, tuition reimbursement. The number at the bottom of the page looked unreal to me. It was more money than I had ever seen attached to my name. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself. Margaret studied me for a long moment. "Because hungry people either break or become dangerous," she said. "I think you became disciplined instead." That night, I walked home through downtown Cleveland holding the offer letter inside my jacket while freezing wind whipped between the buildings. Every restaurant window I passed reflected a different version of my life back at me. Families eating dinner together. Young professionals laughing over drinks. Couples planning futures that probably felt stable and predictable. Meanwhile, I still kept emergency cash hidden inside my sock drawer because part of me believed homelessness could return at any moment if I relaxed too much. The new position changed everything slowly. I moved into a small studio apartment with actual furniture instead of folding chairs and borrowed mattresses. I stopped counting every dollar at the grocery store. For the first time in years, I slept through entire nights without waking up panicked about rent money. But success did not feel exciting the way I thought it would. It felt quiet, careful, like holding something fragile with both hands because you know exactly how quickly life can take it away. Over the next few years, Margaret became the closest thing I had to family, although neither of us ever used that word. She taught me how executives think during negotiations, how people reveal themselves when money enters the room, how silence can make powerful men nervous faster than anger ever will. Competence scares insecure people, she told me once during a business dinner in Chicago, especially when it comes from someone they underestimated. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the exhausted kid fixing warehouse terminals. Overnight, promotions came one after another because I worked harder than everyone else and expected nothing from anybody. By 30, I had a corner office overlooking the river a tailored charcoal suit hanging beside my apartment door, and an executive badge that opened floors most employees never saw. But some habits never left me. I still bought generic coffee. I still checked my bank account every morning before work. And hidden inside the top drawer of my desk was the old voicemail my father left 2 weeks after throwing me out. "You will never survive without this family." I listened to it sometimes late at night after everyone else went home. Not because it still hurt, because I wanted to remember exactly what survival had cost me. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing acquisition reports alone in my office. Outside the windows, downtown Cleveland glowed beneath cold November rain, headlights smearing across wet streets 30 floors below. Most of the building had already emptied out for the night. I preferred it that way. Silence made thinking easier. My desk lamp cast a soft circle of light across spreadsheets, financial projections, and merger contracts while jazz played quietly through the office speakers. For a moment, everything felt controlled, predictable. Then my personal phone vibrated against the desk. I almost ignored it because very few people had that number. But when I looked down, my chest tightened before I could stop it. Diane Hayes. My mother. I stared at the screen until the ringing nearly stopped. 10 years. That was how long it had been since I heard her voice. Not on birthdays. Not at graduations. Not when I bought my first apartment or got promoted into senior leadership. 10 years of silence compressed into one glowing name on a phone screen. I answered without speaking. At first all I heard was breathing. Then my mother's voice came through soft and uncertain, older than I remembered. "Caleb." The sound of my name in her voice felt strange now, like hearing a song from childhood in a grocery store years later. Familiar, but distant. "Yes," I said calmly. She exhaled shakily. "I was not sure this was still your number." Neither of us spoke for a few seconds after that. Rain tapped softly against the office windows while traffic crawled below the building. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Your father has been having a difficult time at work," she said carefully. There it was. Not "I miss you." Not "how have you been." Straight to the problem. Some things never changed. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "What kind of difficult time?" Silence again. "The manufacturing company he works for is downsizing," she admitted quietly. "A lot of people may lose their jobs." I glanced automatically toward the acquisition folders spread across my desk. One company name sat highlighted across multiple documents. Ridgemont Industrial Systems. My father's employer. Langford Logistics had been negotiating a takeover for weeks. Suddenly the knot in my stomach made sense. "And Brandon?" I asked. My mother let out a tired breath that sounded almost embarrassed. "Things have not gone well for him either." I closed my eyes briefly. Brandon had always moved through life like consequences belonged to other people. "How bad?" I asked. "He invested in a restaurant franchise with friends from Chicago," she said quietly. "It failed last spring. There are debts." Of course there were. I looked out across the dark city while she continued speaking in careful pieces, as if trying not to sound desperate. Medical bills. Mortgage pressure. Brandon moving back home temporarily. My father refusing early retirement packages because they could not afford it. Every sentence carried the same hidden message beneath it. They needed help. The strange part was not the anger I expected to feel. It was how little surprise remained inside me. Deep down, I think I always knew this call would eventually come someday. Not because they suddenly loved me differently. Because life had finally cornered them the same way it cornered me at 18. "You have done very well for yourself," my mother said after a long pause. I almost laughed at that. She did not ask how I survived those years. She already knew survival was possible now that it benefited them. "Who gave you my number?" I asked calmly. Another hesitation. "Margaret Cole." That caught my attention immediately. Margaret had never interfered in my personal life before. Why would she do that? My mother lowered her voice slightly. "Because she knows your father's company is being acquired." The office suddenly felt much quieter than before. I looked down at the acquisition folder again, while a cold understanding slowly settled over me. This was not coincidence. It was convergence. Every sleepless night, every warehouse shift, every humiliating year spent proving I could survive without them. Somehow all of it had been moving silently toward this exact moment. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and disbelief, another feeling began rising slowly for the first time in years. Not revenge. Something colder than that. Perspective. The acquisition meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock Monday morning in the executive boardroom, at Langford headquarters. By 7:30, the entire floor already smelled like coffee, printer toner, and expensive cologne. Assistants moved quickly between offices carrying legal binders while analysts reviewed final valuation reports on tablets near the elevators. Outside the windows, downtown Cleveland disappeared beneath low gray clouds rolling in from the lake. I stood alone near the conference table adjusting the cuffs of my charcoal suit while the city slowly woke below us. 10 years earlier, I had been sleeping in bus stations wondering how long $43 could keep somebody alive. Now my employee badge opened doors guarded by private security. Life changed quietly until suddenly it looked completely different. Victor Langford arrived first. Even in his 60s, he carried himself with the kind of calm authority that made entire rooms lower their voices automatically. He set a thick folder onto the table and loosened his tie slightly before looking at me. "You reviewed the restructuring proposals?" he asked. "3 times, I answered. He nodded once. "Good. Ridgemont has been bleeding money for years. We need leadership that understands efficiency." Efficiency. Corporate language always sounded clean when describing painful things. Layoffs became restructuring. Financial. Desperation became transition periods. Human fear became percentages inside spreadsheets. Victor opened the acquisition file while several board members filtered into the room around us. "You will oversee the operational integration personally," he continued. Margaret insisted on it. At the mention of her name, I glanced briefly toward the empty seat near the far end of the table. Margaret entered moments later carrying a slim leather portfolio. She looked composed as always, though her eyes lingered on me for half a second longer than usual, like she already understood what this morning meant before I did. "Ridgemont executives arrive in 20 minutes, Victor said. "Their manufacturing division needs aggressive downsizing if this acquisition is going to survive." He slid several personnel reports toward me. Human Resources flagged redundant management positions for immediate review. I looked down casually at first. Then my eyes stopped moving. Thomas Hayes, Senior Floor Supervisor. 32 years with the company. My father's name sat there in black ink beside projected termination costs and severance estimates. For a moment, the entire room seemed strangely distant. Voices blurred together beneath the hum of projectors and quiet conversation around the table. I stared at the page while memories surfaced without warning. My father standing in the kitchen doorway telling me the world did not reward attitude. The porch light shutting off behind me. The voicemail hidden inside my desk drawer all these years. "Caleb." Margaret's voice pulled me back. I realized everyone had gone quiet. Victor studied me carefully from across the table. "Problem?" he asked. I closed the file slowly. "No," I answered. My voice sounded calm even to me. "No problem." But something had shifted inside me during those few seconds. Not anger. Not satisfaction either. Just clarity. I finally understood what Margaret meant years ago when she said insecure people fear competence from those they underestimated. My father spent his entire life believing authority belonged naturally to him because he was older, louder, stronger. He never imagined the quiet son he threw away could someday sit across from executives deciding the future of his company. The irony almost felt too perfect to be real. At 8 o'clock sharp, the boardroom doors opened. Ridgemont executives began filing inside, carrying laptops and legal pads, while assistants poured fresh coffee around the table. I stayed seated near the head of the room, reviewing acquisition notes with measured focus. Then, halfway through the introductions, I saw him walk in. My father looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone mostly gray around the temples, and his shoulders carried the slight heaviness of someone worn down by years of stress and overtime shifts. Behind him came my mother, Diane, dressed carefully in a navy coat like she wanted to appear more confident than she felt. Brandon followed last, wearing an expensive suit that looked slightly too flashy for the room. None of them noticed me immediately. Then my father looked up, and everything stopped. My father froze with one hand still resting on the back of his chair. For a second, nobody in the room moved. The quiet hum of the projector filled the silence while rain streaked slowly down the windows behind us. I watched recognition spread across his face in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something deeper that looked dangerously close to fear. My mother's lips parted slightly when she finally saw me sitting beside Victor Langford at the head of the conference table. Brandon looked back and forth between all of us like he thought this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Caleb, my mother whispered softly. Hearing my name spoken like that after 10 years almost felt surreal. But I kept my expression neutral and gestured politely toward the empty seats across from us. Please, I said calmly. We should begin. Nobody sat down immediately. My father still stared at me like he could not fit the image in front of him together with the memory he carried in his head. I understood why. The last time he saw me, I was 18 years old standing in the rain with a backpack and nowhere to sleep. Now I wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried executive authority inside a room worth more money than he probably imagined. People from both companies waited awkwardly while the silence stretched too long. Finally, Victor cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, he said toward my father, you may take your seat. That seemed to snap him back into motion. Slowly, my parents sat across from me while Brandon adjusted his tie nervously beside them. I noticed his hands shaking slightly when he reached for the water glass in front of him. Margaret sat quietly near the far end of the table, observing everything without interruption. The meeting started formally enough. Financial summaries, transition timelines, operational restructuring. I spoke evenly while reviewing projected integration plans on the presentation screen behind me. Years earlier, I would have given anything for my father to look at me with respect. Now he could barely maintain eye contact at all. Every few minutes, I caught him studying me carefully like he was searching for traces of the son he used to know. But that version of me no longer existed. Somewhere between warehouse shifts, unpaid bills, and 10 years of silence, that boy disappeared completely. About halfway through the meeting, Victor handed me the personnel restructuring report. Mr. Hayes will oversee workforce optimization during the transition period, he announced casually to the room. My father looked up sharply at that. So did Brandon. I opened the folder calmly, even though I already knew every name inside it by memory. As part of the acquisition, I explained professionally, several management redundancies will need evaluation over the next quarter. The words sounded cold coming out of my mouth, but corporate language always did. My mother folded her hands tightly together in her lap, while Brandon shifted uncomfortably beside her. Finally, my father spoke for the first time since entering the room. You work here? He asked quietly. Not angry, not proud either, just stunned. I looked at him steadily. I oversee operational strategy for Midwest integration projects, I answered. Brandon gave a short, nervous laugh. Seriously? He asked. You? I noticed Victor glance toward him immediately, unimpressed by the interruption. Brandon cleared his throat awkwardly and leaned back in his chair. My father still looked shaken. Nobody told us, he muttered. There was nobody to tell, I replied calmly. That sentence landed harder than I expected. My mother lowered her eyes toward the table while my father sat very still across from me. For years, I imagined dramatic confrontations where I would finally tell them how badly they hurt me. But sitting there now, none of those speeches mattered anymore. Success changes certain wounds. Not because the past disappears, but because eventually you stop needing the people who created it to understand your pain. Near the end of the meeting, Victor announced a short break before final negotiations resumed. Chairs slid back across polished floors while executives gathered coffee and reviewed documents near the windows. My parents stayed seated. Nobody moved. Then my father looked directly at me for the first time all morning and said something so quietly I almost missed it. You really survived. I held his gaze for several seconds before answering. Yes, I said simply. I did. The break room outside the boardroom overlooked the riverfront through massive floor-to-ceiling windows streaked with rain. Executives gathered in small circles near the coffee station discussing market projections and integration deadlines, while assistants hurried between offices carrying revised contracts. I stood alone beside the window holding a paper cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. Behind me, the city moved through another gray Monday morning completely unaware that 10 years of silence had just collided inside one conference room. I heard my mother approach before she spoke. You look tired, Diane said softly. The comment almost made me smile because it sounded so painfully ordinary after everything that had happened. I turned slightly toward her. Up close, she looked older than I remembered. Fine lines framed her eyes now, and there was a nervousness in her posture I had never seen growing up. My mother used to move through life carefully protected by my father's certainty. That certainty looked weaker now. Long weeks, I answered calmly. She nodded while twisting her wedding ring slowly around her finger. Margaret told us you worked very hard, she said quietly. I glanced toward the boardroom where Margaret stood reviewing documents with Victor. She gave me opportunities, I replied. My mother lowered her eyes briefly. We did not know where you went after you left. That sentence settled heavily between us. Not because I believed it completely, but because some part of me realized she wanted forgiveness without saying the word directly. You could have called, I said gently. Diane swallowed hard, but did not answer. A few seconds later, my father joined us near the window. He still carried himself stiffly, like pride had become muscle memory after decades of using it to survive. But something in his face looked unsettled now. Smaller somehow. He stared out at the rain for a long moment before finally speaking. Victor Langford says you are one of the best executives in the company. I took a slow sip of coffee. That is generous of him. My father nodded once. You always worked hard. It was probably the closest thing to praise he had ever given me. Years ago, I would have held on to a sentence like that for months. Now it just sounded late. Brandon arrived a moment later carrying a second cup of coffee and forcing an uneasy smile onto his face. Man, he said awkwardly, this is crazy. Small world, huh? Nobody answered immediately. Brandon shifted his weight nervously. Look, about the past, he continued carefully. Dad was under a lot of stress back then. There it was. The family instinct to explain pain instead of acknowledging it. My father frowned slightly, but did not interrupt him. Brandon gave a short laugh that sounded more desperate than confident. Honestly, nobody thought you would end up running half the Midwest. I looked at him calmly. Neither did I. That honesty seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, all four of us stood there listening to rain strike the glass while downtown traffic crawled across the bridge below. Then my father cleared his throat quietly. There are rumors about layoffs, he said carefully. Finally, the real reason beneath all the careful conversation. My mother's shoulders tightened slightly. Beside him, Brandon stared down into his coffee cup. I already knew the numbers. Ridgemont would eliminate dozens of management positions during restructuring. Some departments would disappear completely within 6 months. There will be changes, I answered professionally. My father nodded slowly. I have given 32 years to that company. I know, I said. He looked at me directly then, and for the first time since this morning, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Not authority, not anger, just a man realizing his future might depend on the son he once threw away. Family should help family, he said quietly. The sentence hung there between us while rain blurred the skyline outside. 10 years ago, those words could have saved me from sleeping in bus stations and laundromats. But back then, nobody said them. I studied my father carefully before answering. That is not what you taught me at 18. Neither of my parents spoke after that. Brandon looked away completely. Somewhere behind us, the boardroom doors opened again as executives returned to the meeting. I placed my untouched coffee cup onto the counter and adjusted my suit jacket calmly. Then I walked back toward the conference room while my family remained standing silently beside the rain-covered windows. The final negotiations lasted nearly 3 more hours. Lawyers reviewed contract language line by line while executives debated severance packages, manufacturing timelines, and operational budgets projected across massive presentation screens. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the city washed gray beneath weak afternoon sunlight. Most people in the room looked exhausted by the end of it. I barely noticed the passing time. Years of surviving uncertainty had trained me to stay calm long after everyone else became emotionally tired. Around 1:30, Victor Langford closed the final acquisition binder and adjusted his glasses. Gentlemen, he said evenly, I believe we have an agreement. Pens moved across paper while assistants collected signed documents from both sides of the table. Just like that, 32 years of Ridgemont Industrial Systems officially became another division. Inside Langford Logistics, my father sat quietly during the final signatures. The confidence he carried into the building that morning had disappeared completely now. He looked like a man trying to understand how quickly life could rearrange itself without permission. Brandon checked his phone constantly throughout the meeting, pretending distraction while avoiding eye contact with me. My mother barely spoke at all. Once the contracts were finalized, Victor stood and addressed the room. Department evaluations will begin immediately, he announced. Executive recommendations for retention packages will be submitted by the end of the week. Several Ridgemont managers exchanged nervous glances at that. Everyone understood what those words really meant. Some people would stay, others would leave. And for the first time in my life, my family sat waiting for my decision instead of the other way around. As the room slowly emptied, Victor placed a folder beside me before leaving with the legal team. "Your recommendations," he said quietly. "I trust your judgment." Then he walked out without another word. The folder contained every management review tied to the restructuring process. Salaries, performance records, retention projections, severance calculations. My father's name sat near the top of the list. Brandon's appeared much farther down under a temporary consulting contract recently created through Ridgemont Connections. I studied both files silently while the boardroom emptied around me. Finally, only my family and Margaret remained. My mother looked exhausted now, like the emotional weight of the day had settled fully onto her shoulders. Brandon leaned back in his chair trying to appear relaxed, but his knee bounced nervously beneath the table. My father sat perfectly still across from me with both hands folded tightly together. Nobody spoke at first. Then Brandon cleared his throat awkwardly. "Look," he said carefully, "I know things were rough back then, but maybe this is a chance to move forward." I glanced at him calmly. "Forward?" He nodded quickly. "We are family." The sentence almost sounded rehearsed. My father lowered his eyes toward the table while my mother watched me anxiously. I closed the personnel folder slowly before answering. "When I was 18, I said quietly, I spent 3 winters wondering where I would sleep at night." Nobody interrupted. "I worked loading trucks before sunrise and studied at night because failure meant disappearing completely." Brandon shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. Not once during those years did anybody ask if I needed help. My voice never rose. That made the room feel even quieter somehow. My father finally looked at me again. "I was wrong," he admitted softly. Hearing those words from him felt strange after carrying their absence for so many years. Not satisfying, just heavy. Margaret remained silent near the window, letting the moment unfold naturally. I looked down at the retention recommendations one final time before signing my decision forms carefully with a black fountain pen. Then I slid the folder across the table toward human resources. "Thomas Hayes will remain under full retention benefits and healthcare coverage," I said professionally. My mother exhaled sharply beside him, relief flooding across her face almost instantly. My father looked stunned. Brandon leaned forward hopefully. "And me?" he asked quickly. I met his eyes calmly. "Your consulting contract will not continue after transition." His face dropped immediately. "What?" he said. "Come on, Caleb, seriously?" I held his gaze steadily. "You are 32 years old, Brandon. Figure life out on your own." The room went completely silent after that. My father closed his eyes briefly while my mother stared down at the table. Brandon looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. And for the first time since I was 18 years old standing alone in the rain, I finally understood something important. Revenge does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like refusing to carry people who once watched you drown.